Well, hello. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. We really appreciate you joining us from wherever you are. My name is Sterling Wilson with Object First, and I am joined by my good buddy Brent Earls from Mirazon. How you doing today, Brent?
Doing pretty well.
All right, all right. Well, we've got some really interesting discussions today. We appreciate everyone joining us. We're going to be diving into a little bit about immutability, what immutability means, and really how we can apply it with the facets of our data today. But before we get started, we would love to hear where you're from. Go ahead and jot down in the comments where you're from, where you're calling in from. And as always, we love to keep this interactive. So let us know if you have any questions during the time. We've got my buddy, Mr. Matt Price, behind the scenes, keeping things flowing, and he's going to keep us honest and make sure that we don't miss any of your comments. So with that, let's just dive right in today. Brent, we talk a lot in the industry about data and, of course, data security and, of course, the facets of keeping your data secure. But one thing that kind of comes up often is the term immutability. I feel sometimes like immutability is kind of thrown around like cloud, or dare I say AI. What do you think?
Yeah, it's one of those things where everybody has made up their own definition. When it really comes down to it, immutability means not mutable, aka not changeable. You can't change this. So when something's immutable, it is there, and no matter what you do, you can't change it. So to make that a thing, you have to think kind of through all the different parts of it. A tape, tape drive and an old tape, yeah, that's immutable unless you have a hammer. So, physical security makes it mutable
Right.
technically at
Exactly.
that point, like it does most things.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, we're seeing kind of everybody throw out their own definitions, but when it really comes down to it, that's what you're going for is something that cannot be changed.
Cannot be altered, deleted, or modified. Right now,
Mhm.
that we've those of us that have been around for a while, we've sort of heard this term used before, and maybe in some different ways. Worm.
Yeah.
Read once or write once, read many. Um, if we talk a little bit about worm and where that came from, that really started from some different facets of that we needed around our data, right? I mean, we're talking more like regulations or safeguarding files, archiving integrity. Is that kind of where you think we've started from?
Yeah, I mean, the first time I really got experience with Worm was Centera. The old became EMC technology,
Yep.
expensive as could be, but we used it a lot for government stuff where we had tax records, and those never needed to change. Once they were submitted, they had to stay that way forever. And before that, they were burning them to DVDs
Yep.
and keeping them in a corner somewhere. But they went to that because they could keep the data online available, but no one could ever alter it. No one could ever change it. And so that's kind of the first experience I got with an online worm based thing. But it was based essentially in that system, at least the way it was set up, it was permanently immutable. There was never a change period. So it was once it goes in there for 7 years, it's immutable and then it just gets deleted and it's gone. Um, and that's an early version, but that's similar to what we're kind of doing now. The original premise of the worm type devices was to mimic tape or CDs, where you write it once, you got it there, and no one can change it, essentially.
Yeah, exactly. And much like you, some of my first experiences with Worm, I was managing a team actually for a financial institution. And I learned two things when I was there. One was the word audit. Uh, and the next, of course, was the needing of sort of this worm. We did it in several different ways. Like you said, CDs were one way to go in there that we could prove to auditors that no one could actually change that. But today, our data is a little bit different, right? We have to set a different set of circumstances around it. And of course, we talk about immutable storage in the form of backups. How have you kind of seen that change and sort of twist into sort of that worm culture into this newer sort of immutable storage and still allowing our data to work for us?
Yeah, it's kind of funny. We've originally we did backups all to tape, and tape basically was immutable. Once it's not in the drive anymore, it's an offline copy, you've got it. And then everybody wanted faster restores, faster restores. So we went to storing all our backups on hard drives, which is great. They're immediately accessible. We can get to stuff quick. We can deal with permissions on them to make sure it can't just generically be deleted, but we've got it there.
Yeah.
And then malicious actors started becoming a real thing. The last 5 years, 6 years, whatever it's been, ransomware started being a thing, just actually malicious people getting in to do things. And all of a sudden, those backups being online went from a great thing to a liability, because now all my copies are online and accessible, but that means they're online and accessible to bad people. So they can get in, they can delete stuff, and it didn't matter where they were, because we had people like, oh, well, I've got a DR site. It's like, yeah, it's connected to your main site though. Like, I've got cloud copies. Yeah, but it's just a file server in the cloud. Like, it's still online, it's available. And that's when really trying to get an immutable copy started being, it's basically zero trust is what we hear all the time in the industry around generic security. But assuming everyone is out to get you, essentially, paranoia for a reason. So you have to make sure that even the good copies that you want can't be deleted accidentally or purposefully. And so it's really come back around from that standpoint.
That's a really interesting point. When we talked about the beginning of sort of that worm stage, that was really to sort of prove that we could hold on to records, not delete records and those types of things. But nowadays we're dealing with, of course, threat actors that want to gain our data, take it, sell it, exfiltrate it, do all those things. Immutable storage is really one of those, the main ways to really keep a threat actor. And there's some other ways. Immutability is not enough, right? But it's a great first sort of foray into that. What are some things, I'm kind of throwing you a softball here because I hear this all the time. I want to clarify this for everybody listening. We hear immutability thrown around a lot. Let's go over a couple of things about our thoughts about what we think immutability isn't. Okay, you go first.
Yeah. So, we said immutability, you can't add, change, modify, delete data. So some people are offering solutions where it's literally something you install on a Windows server. You point it to a folder and it's like, okay, this folder can't be edited. It's still a Windows box. I can still just right click the drive and say format and it's gone.
Yeah.
There's a lot of different things where if you look at it in a microcosm and you just look at this one thing, yeah, it's immutable. But if you step just 2 feet away from it, you're like, oh, okay, yeah, I can still kill that.
Yeah.
And then there's some that are like virtual appliances. It's like, cool, it works perfectly as long as no one gets any
Has
access to
all the
VMware.
features. Yeah. Looks real, sounds real, feels real, until you can just go to the root of the VSA and just delete it, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So when it really comes down to it with immutability, you've kind of got to step back and look at the overall solution and
Yeah.
how many layers of defense you're really getting for. I mean, we've said for years, physical access, if you can get it with a hammer, then pretty much nothing will help you. But
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, and it really kind of talks about, and we'll be stepping into this in a second, but really, you really have to have a comprehensive solution set today, right? There isn't any one attack vector that you can just completely close off and kind of be sort of done with it. But you pointed out a lot of things is that our data is in many different layers now. Some are in virtualized layers, cloud ready, cloud first, on premises. How do you begin to explain to customers about what their needs around immutability is? And what are some of the things they should kind of keep in mind when they're thinking, where should I put my data? Veeam in itself is so powerful. It allows, any of the users to use any kind of data sets to save their data. But what should they be thinking about when they really want to make sure their data is safe?
Yeah, and there's a few different things that go down to it. Separation, making sure it's somewhere else.
Yeah.
The guy with the hammer who's going to beat the crap out of your stuff,
Yeah.
it's probably only in one building. He's probably not in the cloud and another building at the same time.
Yeah.
So you've got to keep separation in mind. So if you're a cloud first environment, putting your backups in that same cloud vendor might not make the most sense. Like, well, it's a different region. It's like, yeah, but I mean, Azure, AWS, GCP have all had their entire control plane go down before, where it didn't matter what region, you couldn't log in.
Yeah.
So keeping that separation. So, oh yeah, you're cloud first, cool. Maybe you need to isolate this to a different cloud, or maybe you want to pull a copy on-prem. You've got your old data center, you've got, bandwidth there already. Maybe pull a copy local. There's a whole lot of different things you can do, but it goes back to the same principles we've talked about forever. Veeam and their 3-2-1-1
I think there's
rule.
a 0 in there now
Yeah,
too, right?
0. But 3 copies of your data,
Yes.
different locations, different media,
Yeah.
testing your backups is what
Yeah.
they keep adding extra stuff to. But you've got to keep these somewhere separate from your production. You've got to be able to make sure they're in a different format, essentially. That they're separate from what your production's on. Like we were just
Yeah.
talking about with the cloud. Same thing applies on-prem. We mentioned that virtual appliance for immutability. Well, if it's running in the same VMware infrastructure as your production, or it's the DR site, but it's in the same vCenter, I can just delete the VM at that point.
Yeah.
So,
There are those considerations that they really need to consider when they're doing those things.
mhm.
Speaking of the considerations there, when we talk about cloud itself, I feel like the cloud is really, I don't want to say progressed or not progressed, but it's sort of morphed. I feel like in the beginning, we really kind of all thought all of our data was going to live in the cloud, period. And that was kind of going to be the end of it. It really did open up the idea of sort of disparate offices could share the same data. You can replicate in sort of real time. It opened up all of these things. And in some ways, being able to create data lakes. But then the threat actors kind of started kind of coming in and doing things to that data. And of course, the cloud providers within the contract that everybody signs, they aren't responsible for the backing up or restoration of the data. Tell me a little bit about how you've seen sort of the cloud adoption change with this new set of circumstances with the threat actors, and how do you help the clients decide where their data should be?
Yeah, I mean, part of it comes to that all your eggs in one basket type conversation.
Yeah.
Um, there was a lot of discussion early on. We're going to move everything to the cloud. We're going to move everything to the cloud. It's like, cool. How do you guarantee when everything hits the fan, you can actually restore your stuff?
Yeah.
You're in Azure, you're using Azure Backup, you're sending it to a different region. Cool. Nothing is outside of Microsoft's control at that point. It's fully on them. You're beholden to them entirely. So as we started having some of those conversations, people were like, well, okay, maybe I'll send a copy to AWS. And it's like, okay, well, that's separation. Then they're like, wow, the bandwidth costs are expensive to egress out of Azure. And now I'm also paying for all the AWS storage as well. My monthly cost just went up quite a bit.
Yeah.
And then they start talking about what it would actually be like to try to restore in AWS from Azure. And it's like, oof, this is getting pretty complicated. I've basically got to rebuild my infrastructure to be ready for it over there. And so we've actually seen the term the industry apparently adopted was some cloud repatriation,
Yeah.
but essentially pulling some of those resources back. And some of that has been backups, largely because when it comes down to it, your job's on the line as an IT professional for keeping the data. And it doesn't matter if you keep 5 nines for 10 years straight.
Yeah.
If when you have an interruption, the data is gone and you have no recourse for bringing it back, it's over. The business is probably going to collapse from that standpoint.
Yeah.
So a lot of people have been pulling backups back if they're fully cloud, pulling a copy of backups back. So essentially they can hug their data.
Yeah.
They've got that extra safety layer of, even if the world ends, I know right here I have a copy of everything. Even
Yeah.
if I don't have servers to run it on, I've got my copy. I've got something here that I can trust.
Yeah.
But then as the bad actors started coming in, they're getting everywhere. They're getting in the environment and sniffing around for days, weeks, months sometimes before they ever do anything malicious. So they're finding everything. So then even though people were having a copy of their backups, that copy was getting got with everything else because they took the time to find it, and if it wasn't immutable. So it's really got to the point where immutability is non-optional. It doesn't really matter what type of organization, what type of design you have, be it cloud first, be it on-prem first, be it hybrid. Immutability just has to happen. Now you've got to keep something that's your safety net with when everything goes bad.
Immutability absolutely is not an option. I think you made some really good points. First of all, Matt, if you're listening to this, I need a t-shirt, buddy, that says hug your data. I mean, Brent nailed that one. I would love to have that. But, we're also having a lot of, I travel. I went to RSA recently. We're at a lot of these security conferences. And you nailed it about the ingress and the egress fees of duplicating your copies to multi-cloud. But we're also seeing, to your point, when it's time to restore, it's just the amount of time that it takes, even if you can touch that. So being able to your point, hug your data on premises where you can touch it, get to it, and be able to manipulate it and put the right set of circumstances that you need for your business, I think is really why we're saying it's immutability is not enough, but being able to get to your immutability storage in a super fast way to be able to recover immediately is really what we're going for now. There's one more thing you touched on as well that I'd like to kind of go back to is that bad actors could still own your accounts. They can still get in. They can still steal things. And if you're using certain solutions, let's call them quasi immutable. Maybe they were roll your own. Maybe they made them, in there to save some time. They made a hardened repository or something like that. If you have those credentials, you can lessen those permissions and do anything you want to that storage itself, right? So isn't it also about sort of segmenting those backups or those backup credentials as well as making the data immutable?
Yeah, and we're always talking about defense in depth when it comes to cybersecurity. So you don't just put a firewall in and then go, everything's great. No, you still put EDR on every laptop in the environment. You still run vulnerability scans. You still put email filtering on. You do all these things to make you secure, and backups are part of your security ecosystem. They're the break glass part of your security ecosystem, but you've got to have those protected and safe. And so we're always proposing for people to have, when they're doing their 3-2-1 rule of separating stuff out, we're always talking about putting different systems in place for it with different credentials, isolating things. When we're building backup infrastructures now for most people, we're putting them on isolated networks that have very minimal conversations with the real network. We're not trying to keep everything super easily accessible. We're kind of segmenting that out. And with all of that, of course, adds some complexity to the environment. And there's a lot of different ways you can do that. Veeam has their hardened repo, which is a great tool. It works really well, but it requires you to secure the hardware and the operating system. Once you get that done, the immutability part of it works really well. But if you're not a Linux person, that becomes a bit of a challenge for you. Or if you're just using whatever hardware you had sitting around, oh, well, you have the latest BIOS and firmware from HP? Well, see, we didn't renew support and they paywall their BIOS, so no. It's like, well, there's a major vulnerability in the firmware. It's like, oh, well, crap. So you've basically got to be keeping those layers together, keeping everything isolated in every way you can, because this is part of your overall security ecostructure.
That's tough. I mean, what you just laid out right there. I mean, we are, data management experts. We're people who take care of the data. We're not necessarily security experts, and now we're thrown into sort of the throes of having to understand all of these terms, not just immutability, zero access, and zero trust, the segmentation of data. It just sounds like a lot to stay on top of when I just need to make sure my company's data is safe. To those that aren't experts, where do they start?
Yeah, I mean, obviously I'm biased, but talk to a consultant or somebody who knows what they're doing and does this every day. It's obviously a good way to get some information about it. But when it comes down to it, just step back and kind of draw your environment is a really good way to start. Draw where your stuff is and draw both the production and the backups and any DR you may have. And if one jet engine or one angry person can take an entire layer out, you need to add another layer. You need to put something else in. You need to get something that will take care of you in that regard. From one of the key things around all this is no matter how much you do, people will still be grumpy when something happens. So it's like, oh, hey, we have a copy of our backups in Wasabi. Great. We lost everything else. It's like, okay, well, how quick are we going to be back up?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, the restores are going to take about 4 or 5 days. 4 or 5 days, like, but we didn't lose everything. Like, no, 4 or 5 days is unacceptable. We got to get this faster. So once you finally figure out overall where you're isolating and separating, then you've got to figure out what the actual RTOs, RPOs look like on those different levels of disaster. So getting immutability is great. That's your punt. But everyone knows that the CEO, the COO are immediately going to be like, why isn't it up faster? So that's where you look at getting immutability at multiple places.
Yeah.
Where, okay, they took out my ESX infrastructure. I lost everything. They encrypted at the VMware level, but my immutable backups are right here. They're my primary backups. I run on those. So we didn't lose any data. All I have to do is reimage those ESX servers and I can restore at 10 gig speeds to get everything back up and going.
That's right.
So you're basically looking at it starting out from that actual isolation and protection standpoint. Then you're working on what the business is actually going to say when you start doing those restores and how you can get business back up. Because in the end, IT is a business enabler. Our job is to let other people do their job. So when we're down and they can't, people get upset. So you need to be able to restore it as quickly as possible, have multiple ways of restoring it, and keep everybody functional.
That was an amazing breakdown. And I think you made a big case as to why you really need a knowledgeable consultant on your side during this process to help you really identify what your data goals are, what your RTOs and RPOs really should be. And even though you're always going to have some grumpy people, how can you sort of lessen that grumpiness? There are some other ways that we talk about, certainly with, object storage and OOTB, being able to sort of leverage some of the goodness of Veeam, the SOS API, Veeam's encryption, all of that stuff. Talk to me about a little bit about, when we talk about that on-premises storage, being able to recover quickly. Why do you prefer Object First OOTB, and really, how has that helped your customers leverage their data goals?
Yeah, we touched on it earlier. Having a cloud copy of your data is great if you're on-prem,
Yeah,
but when you try to restore, it's slow.
yeah,
So if you go to VeeamON, which is coming up in less than a month, I think now, they're going to be talking about the Veeam hardened repo a lot. You're going to do labs on it, assuming they do like normal, and it looks really, really cool. But what they don't go through in that is setting everything else up. So you've got to set up Linux, you've got to secure that Linux, you've got to get the hardware updated, you've got to get all that going just to be able to get the hardened repo set up. The lab is only after all that's been done.
yeah.
So you've got to set all that up. Like we talked about, you've got to be the Linux expert to make that happen. And then you've got an immutable on-premise copy that you now have to maintain regularly. One of the things that attracted us to Object First originally was that it's an all-in-one box. We drop this box. It takes less than 15 minutes to set it up. Everything's up and going. And then at that point, I integrate it with Veeam through literally 5 clicks in Veeam. And anything I put on it's immutable. And it's a fast enough primary backup target that I can be doing my normal 15-minute backups to OOTB, and they're immediately immutable. So instead of waiting for, oh, I did my backup at 5 p.m., but it's not going to make it to the cloud until like 7 a.m. tomorrow. It's like a VMCE test. Like, oh, so what restore point do I have available at this point?
Yeah.
Instead, everything's immutable right from the jump. So if we get hit at 2:33 a.m. and I ran a backup at 2:15, I've already got it. I've lost at most 15 minutes of data from that because it was immutable immediately. And then from a security standpoint, it's a one-click upgrade. I don't have to worry about BIOS firmware. I don't have to worry about Linux hardening. I don't have to worry about software. I literally just go to a page that says update, click update, and it's done. So I don't have to be the cybersecurity expert. I just have to click the button and it goes.
That is key. And of course, that takes that piece out of the equation when you have all those other things to consider when they're talking to Mirzan about, their whole data architecture here. I'm looking forward to seeing you at VeeamON next month. Matt, throw that QR code up one more time. If you're out there listening right now and you'd like to get a free pass to hang out with Brent and myself, maybe attend a VIP party or two, definitely click that link. We definitely want to continue to carry on this conversation, and we will be live at VeeamON there. So I know we're getting to the top of the half an hour. There's so much more to talk about, not only with your entire architecture, your data sets, whether they're in cloud or on premises, but how to keep them safe. But for now, anything to wrap up with that you'd like them to kind of think about, Brent?
Yeah, backups have always been a secondary job of IT. The primary job was, oh, well, fix this file server permission, and oh, this user's password needs reset. And backups were always that secondary thing that we'll work on this when we have time. You know, oh, we got new production servers. Well, the old production servers will be the backup servers, and, you know, whatever. It was always the second class citizen.
It's true.
But the evolving cyber risk now means you cannot take that approach anymore. Backups have to be protected. They have to be a primary job. You have to be doing them regularly, making sure they're passing, making sure that you're always counting on that worst case thing happening, as opposed to, well, you know, if somebody deletes the PowerPoint, hopefully we can get it back. But in the end, they click delete. It's not my big problem. But that's not how it is anymore. It's somebody outside your organization, Control A, delete on everything you have.
That's right.
So backups have to be a core primary job function for every IT person now, that's top of mind, that they're thinking about and working on and treating like a production workload instead of just something else to do.
Yeah. Well said. And that was a great wrap up. You know, immutability, is no longer an option. And if you want to know where your data is and really start to get a grab on that and where your data should be to be able to recover quickly, you want to learn more about how Mirazon and Object First and our 𝐕 can help you hug your data, then definitely scan those codes and get with us. And we'll definitely continue the conversation. We appreciate your time today. Thank you. And we look forward to seeing you soon. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.